I should have known better. I should have anticipated the mocking glances, the dismissive chuckles, and the soft but hurtful words my family would throw at me for choosing to care for Grandpa in his last years. But even as I tried to explain, to justify why I couldn't leave his side, it felt like I was speaking in a foreign language. No one understood. Or worse, they just didn't care. "You're wasting your life," my sister said that evening, her voice heavy with a mixture of judgment and pity. "You have so much potential. Why throw it all away on a man who can't even remember his own name most days?" Her words pierced me, but I didn't let them show. This wasn't the first time my family had made me feel small, invisible, like my choices and sacrifices didn't matter. It wasn't the first time they'd dismissed Grandpa as just another old man fading away. But it was the first time they had made me question my decision, even for a second. Was I wasting my life? Or was I doing the right thing? "I'm not wasting my life," I replied quietly, trying to sound more certain than I felt. "I'm doing what's right. He's family." But even as I said it, I knew the words would fall on deaf ears. My brother, sitting across the room, let out a sharp laugh, his eyes never leaving his phone screen. "You really think Grandpa's got anything to offer you?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Come on. You've already missed how many birthdays, how many job opportunities just to play nursemaid to an old man who barely recognizes you. All that time for what?" The sting of his words lingered long after he had finished speaking. It was true that I'd missed my fair share of milestones, the promotions that slipped through my fingers, the dinners I never attended, the vacations I couldn't afford to take because I was so wrapped up in Grandpa's care. But I never saw it as a sacrifice. To me, it was just something I had to do. Felt right. But when I looked around at their blank expressions, I started to doubt myself, just for a moment. Grandpa had always been a quiet figure in our family. Stoic, reliable, the kind of man who worked hard, raised us all, but never asked for much in return. I remembered the days he used to tell us stories about his younger years, about the farms and the people he had met. His eyes would light up, and his hands would shake as he described his youth, so full of energy and life, a stark contrast to the frail man he had become. Now, as his memory began to fade, as his health started deteriorating, I was the one who stepped in. My parents were too busy to care for him. My brother was too indifferent, too focused on his own life to be bothered with the nuances of caring for a man who had given up so much of his own time to raise us. It was always me who showed up with a warm meal, me who took him to doctor's appointments, me who sat by his side when the loneliness of old age became too much to bear. The sacrifices were becoming harder, but I never resented them. Not really. Maybe the frustration sometimes bubbled to the surface, but it wasn't about Grandpa. It was about the way my family treated me, like I was doing something wrong, like I was throwing my life away. And despite all my best efforts to brush it off, it hurt. It always hurt. "I can't believe you're okay with this," my sister continued, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp as a knife. "You've got a career to think about, a future. And here you are, wasting it on someone who doesn't even know your name half the time." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that Grandpa wasn't some faceless stranger, some nuisance to be dealt with until his inevitable death. He was family. But she didn't understand that. She didn't understand that caring for someone you loved, someone who had been there for you your whole life, wasn't a waste. It was just what you did. "It's not a waste," I finally said, my voice steadier now, more resolute. "He took care of me when I was little. He taught me how to ride a bike. He gave me advice when I had my first heartbreak. He's family. And that means something." But my words seemed to hang in the air, empty, rejected, swallowed up by the space between us. My brother snorted in disbelief, his eyes still glued to his phone. Yeah, we all remember Grandpa teaching us stuff," he said dismissively, not even looking up. "But that was years ago. This isn't the same anymore. And you're just wasting your time. Time you could be spending on real opportunities." A wave of anger rushed through me. How could they say that? Did they think I didn't know the sacrifices I was making? Did they think I hadn't questioned myself 1,000 times over? But it wasn't about the sacrifices. It was about showing up, about being there when it mattered most. Grandpa didn't ask for a lot. He just wanted someone to listen, someone to care. "You're all so quick to judge," I said through clenched teeth, unable to stop myself. "But you don't know what it's like. You don't understand how much he needs me. You just see it as a chore, something to do because it's easy to criticize from the outside." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken words. I could feel their judgment weighing on me like a 1,000-pound stone. My sister rolled her eyes, clearly fed up, while my brother clicked his tongue in annoyance. "You're a lost cause," my brother muttered under his breath. I stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with a harsh scrape. "I'm not a lost cause. I'm doing what I believe is right. And I don't need anyone's approval to do it." I could feel the heat of their gazes on me as I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't want to hear any more. I didn't want to listen to their criticisms, their condemnation of a choice I had made out of love and responsibility. But despite the anger I felt, despite the words they had thrown at me, deep down I knew the truth. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their understanding. What I needed was the strength to keep going, to keep showing up for Grandpa, even when it felt like no one else cared. Because in the end, I knew I was doing the right thing. And no one, not even my family, could take that away from me. As I walked out of the house, the cold air hit my face, sharp and biting. It was a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere I had just left behind. But as I made my way to the car, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was wasting my life. But then I thought of Grandpa, his kind eyes, his shaky hands, and the way he always made me feel like I mattered. And in that moment I knew. I wasn't wasting my time. I was investing it where it counted most. I never expected to find anything that would make me question everything I thought I knew about Grandpa. But that day, while cleaning out the attic, something unexpected happened. I had been going through boxes of old family photos and mementos, searching for anything that might bring him a little comfort, when I stumbled upon it. A small, dusty leather-bound journal tucked away beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers. I almost didn't open it. I had no right to invade his privacy, but something about the journal called to me. His handwriting, neat and precise, spanned the pages, and the faint scent of ink and aged paper filled the air as I flipped it open. The first few pages were nothing special, just random musings about the weather and his daily routine. But as I moved further, I noticed something strange. Places I didn't recognize. He had written about his life before he became Grandpa, the man I thought I knew. The man who raised me, who taught me how to fish, how to build a birdhouse, how to keep promises. But this was a different man, one I never expected to see. One name kept reappearing in the pages. Eleanor. She wasn't someone I remembered. I had never heard Grandpa speak of her. But his words were unmistakably filled with emotion. "Eleanor's smile," one of the entries read, "is the only thing that could make the whole world seem right again." I sat back, the journal heavy in my hands, the realization hitting me like a thunderclap. My grandfather, the quiet, stoic man who had never shown an ounce of vulnerability, had a secret life, one he had kept hidden from everyone, including me. Eleanor. Who was she? A lover? Friend? And why had he never told anyone about her? I couldn't stop reading. Each entry took me further into his past, revealing a side of him I had never even considered. There were mentions of struggles, of heartbreaks, of a life full of choices he had made long before he ever became the man I knew. He spoke of war, of his time overseas, of people who had come and gone in his life. The pages painted a portrait of a man who had lived fully, despite the silence he wore like armor. Then, as I neared the end of the journal, I found a final entry, one that sent a chill through my spine. I never wanted them to know the truth about me. I couldn't bear it. They wouldn't understand. But maybe it's time. I read the words again. Time for what? What truth was Grandpa hiding? The weight of the journal in my lap felt heavier now, as though it held secrets that could change everything. But how could I ask him about it? How could I confront him with something he had clearly kept buried for so long? A week passed before I found myself standing in front of Grandpa's chair, the old journal in hand, my heart pounding in my chest. He was napping as he often did in the afternoons, his breathing steady and soft. I could see the lines etched deeply on his face, the once vibrant eyes now dull with age and illness. He had always been strong, unshakable. But now I saw him for what he truly was. A man carrying decades of unspoken burdens, a man whose life had been shaped by things I could barely comprehend. The question burned in my mind. Should I ask him about Eleanor? Should I demand to know why he had never told us about the life he had before? But as I looked at him, I hesitated. Was it right to disturb the fragile peace he had created for himself in his final years? I sat beside him, staring at the journal in my hands. I could feel the tension in my chest, the desire to understand, to uncover the man behind the stoic facade. But I knew I couldn't force it. Not like this. Instead, I decided to let him come to me. If he wanted to tell me, he would. If not, I would respect his silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever secret he was keeping, whatever truth lay buried in those pages, had the power to change everything. And maybe, just maybe, it would help me understand why I had chosen to care for him all these years. What had drawn me to him in the first place? The next day, I found myself sitting with Grandpa again. This time, he was more alert, his hands trembling as he tried to adjust the blanket around his legs. He looked up at me, his eyes cloudy but still sharp enough to catch the unease in my expression. "Something on your mind, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but warm like it always had been. I paused, the journal still tucked away under my arm. Should I bring it up? Should I tell him I knew the truth now? Or should I let him keep his secret, just as he had all these years? "I found something," I said finally, my voice shaking slightly. "Something of yours. In the attic." He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You went digging through my stuff, huh?" I didn't mean to," I said quickly. "But I found this journal. You wrote about a lot of things in there. Things I never knew." His face softened, and for a brief moment I thought he might open up. But then the walls came up again, that same impenetrable mask settling into place. "Yeah," he said, "I used to write. Blah. Guess it was the only way I could keep track of the things that mattered." I nodded, the weight of his words hanging in the air. But there was no more to say. Not yet. I left it at that, unable to push any further. The moment passed. And as I walked away from him, the journal still hidden beneath my arm, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Grandpa than I had ever known. And no matter how much I uncovered, no matter how many secrets I unraveled, I knew one thing for sure. Grandpa had never been just the old man who taught me how to fish. He was a man who had lived a full, complicated life. A life that I might never fully understand, but one that had shaped everything he was. But that was okay. Maybe it didn't matter if I knew everything. Maybe the real lesson was to accept him as he was, with all his secrets, with all his flaws. Because in the end, that's what family was about. The unspoken truths. The love that didn't need to be explained. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The day of the will reading arrived much sooner than I expected. It had been a week since Grandpa's funeral, and while the morning had started to settle into a new, awkward routine, there was a quiet undercurrent of tension. My family, especially Aunt Mary and Uncle Joe, kept whispering in hushed tones, casting furtive glances toward one another when they thought I wasn't looking. I could feel it, their anticipation, their anxiety, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Something wasn't right. I sat in the lawyer's office, the heavy scent of old leather and dusty books suffocating the air. The room was far too quiet for my liking, the sound of the grandfather clock ticking like a relentless reminder that time was moving forward, whether we were ready for it or not. Grandpa's lawyer, Mr. Dawson, was a stern, no-nonsense man who had known Grandpa for decades. His expression remained neutral as he shuffled through a stack of papers, adjusting his glasses occasionally, as though he were used to delivering uncomfortable news. I felt an odd mixture of dread and curiosity rising in my chest. The will was supposed to settle things, give us clarity. But the more I thought about Grandpa's secrets, the more I questioned whether there would be any clarity at all. Mr. Dawson cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention to him. "We're all gathered here today for the reading of the will of Mr. Harold Johnson," he began, his voice firm, yet reverberating with an unspoken weight. "As per his request, the contents of his estate and final wishes were to be kept private until this moment. Please take a seat. I will begin." Uncle Joe, his face flushed with impatience, leaned forward in his chair, barely able to hide his excitement. Aunt Mary, ever the composed one, sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I could feel their eyes on me too, as though they were sizing me up, wondering if I would have a claim to anything at all. But I wasn't like them. I didn't care about the money or the property. I just wanted to understand Grandpa. To know the truth about him, his life, his legacy. Mr. Dawson paused, flipping through a few more pages before speaking again. "Mr. Johnson's estate is substantial, though much of it is not in the form of liquid assets." He glanced up, as if gauging our reactions. He owned several properties, investments, and, more surprisingly, a number of rare antique pieces that have been valued highly. He looked directly at Aunt Mary and Uncle Joe. "These things, however, will not be distributed as you might expect." I felt the air in the room shift. Aunt Mary's face tightened, and Uncle Joe shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, I knew something was about to change. Something big. "Mr. Johnson's primary wish," Mr. Dawson continued, "was that all of his personal belongings, including his financial assets, be passed on to the person he trusted most. Someone who, in his words, would understand the importance of the legacy he left behind." He paused, looking around the room, almost as if waiting for someone to speak. The silence stretched on, tense and heavy. My pulse quickened. Who had Grandpa trusted so deeply? I glanced at my relatives. None of them seemed to have any clue. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever Grandpa's will contained, it wasn't going to be simple. "I have here," Mr. Dawson said, his voice lowering, "a document from Mr. Johnson himself. It is a letter, addressed specifically to his family. Allow me to read it aloud." He unfolded the letter slowly, as though he was carefully unwrapping a gift. I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. What had Grandpa written to us? What could he have possibly said that would change everything? Mr. Dawson's voice broke the silence again, reading the letter aloud in a formal tone. "My dear family," he began, "if you are reading this, it means my time has come to an end. I have lived a long life, and I have no regrets. But there is one thing I must make clear before I leave this world. My inheritance is not to be passed down in the way you all expect. I have seen too many families torn apart by greed, by the hunger for more, and I want to avoid that at all costs." I felt a chill run through me as the letter continued, each word adding to the tension in the room. "I have not left my estate to the highest bidder, nor will it be divided among you in a way that you might find fair. Instead, it is going to someone who has proven themselves worthy of it, not because of blood or obligation, but because they truly understand the value of what I am leaving behind." The room was so silent that I could hear the faint rustle of the paper as Mr. Dawson turned the page. "Who does he mean?" Aunt Mary whispered, but her voice was low, barely audible. "Wait," Uncle Joe grumbled. "This doesn't make any sense. He can't just leave everything to someone outside the family." Mr. Dawson's eyes flicked up briefly, but he didn't respond to their outbursts. Instead, he kept reading the letter, his voice unwavering. "Therefore," Grandpa's letter continued, "I have decided that my estate, including all properties and assets, will be transferred to my granddaughter, Emily Johnson. She has shown me over the years that she is not only capable of handling what I leave behind, but that she understands the importance of family. I trust her completely. Please take this inheritance in the spirit it was given. I am at peace knowing she will honor it." My name rang in my ears like a bell. Emily Johnson. It was me. Grandpa had left everything to me. The shock hit me like a wave. Aunt Mary gasped, and Uncle Joe's face turned ashen, his mouth working silently as though he couldn't find the words. I felt my own heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow bursts. It wasn't just that Grandpa had left everything to me. It was the realization that I was suddenly holding the weight of his legacy in my hands. I don't understand, Aunt Mary finally spoke up, her voice shaky. How could he do this? She's barely part of this family. We're his children. We deserve what's ours. Uncle Joe nodded, his face red with frustration. This isn't right. This isn't what he promised us. We're his family. You. He turned to me, his voice rising. You're a kid. You don't even know what to do with any of this. But I couldn't focus on their anger. My mind was spinning. How had Grandpa chosen me? Why me? What had I done to deserve this? More questions, more doubts piled on top of each other. There was more to Grandpa's decision than I could see. I needed to understand why he had trusted me, why he had made this choice. Mr. Dawson cleared his throat, bringing my attention back to the room. The full details of the inheritance will be made available to you, Emily, in time. But for now, the estate is yours to manage. As he finished, the room felt impossibly small. My family was in shock, and I was left standing in the middle of it all, holding a future I wasn't sure I was ready for. Grandpa had left me everything, but was I prepared to honor his legacy? The ink on Grandpa's will had barely dried before the cracks in our family began to widen. In the days that followed the reading, I could already feel the weight of his decisions sinking in, like an anchor dragging the whole family under. What was supposed to bring closure had instead shattered everything. My relatives, who once seemed like a tight-knit unit, united by blood, were now unraveling at the seams, and I was at the center of it all. The first to confront me was Uncle Joe. It happened the day after the will was read. I had gone to the house to start sorting through Grandpa's things, but as soon as I stepped through the front door, I was greeted with his angry face. Emily! He spat my name like it was a curse. You don't deserve any of this. His words hit me with the force of a slap, though I was bracing myself for them. I didn't ask for it, Uncle Joe. I didn't know about the will until yesterday, I said, my voice steady despite the sinking feeling in my chest. The house, now mine, seemed alien to me, like a place I didn't belong. I don't care how you found out, he continued, his hands clenched into fists. This was supposed to be our legacy. It's our right, not yours. Aunt Mary appeared in the doorway, her face drawn and pale. She wasn't as loud as Uncle Joe, but the coldness in her eyes said everything. She was already calculating how she could get a piece of what Grandpa had left. It's true, she said quietly, though her voice carried the same venom as her brother's. You don't understand what you've inherited, Emily. This isn't just property. This is everything. Her words struck a chord deep inside me. I understood the value of what Grandpa had left me. I was just terrified I wasn't ready to handle it. But even so, I wasn't sure if it was worth all the hostility. I'm not the one who decided this, I said, feeling my throat tighten. Grandpa made this choice. I don't know why he did it, but I'm not going to fight you for something he wanted to leave me. You don't have a choice, Uncle Joe barked. You're not even a part of this family in the way we are. You're too young, too inexperienced, and frankly, too naive to know what to do with it all. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I watched them both, their faces twisted with frustration and jealousy, and I realized then that the family I had known was slipping away. Grandpa's death had changed everything. The next few days were a blur of whispers, pointed looks, and veiled threats. I could feel my cousins, who had once treated me like a nuisance, now watching me with a kind of quiet calculation. They, too, seemed to have begun plotting how they could claim a piece of the estate. No one in the family could keep their emotions in check. Not anymore. Everyone was scrambling for a piece of what Grandpa had left behind. It didn't take long before my aunt and uncle's anger escalated. They called for a family meeting, and when I arrived at their house, the tension in the room was palpable. Uncle Joe was pacing back and forth, while Aunt Mary sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You need to give us what's ours," Uncle Joe said, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't just about money or property, Emily. This is about what's right. Grandpa didn't know what he was doing when he left all of this to you. He was confused in his last years." I took a deep breath. The room felt like it was closing in on me. "Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm not going to argue with you. I didn't want any of this. But it's mine now, and I'm not giving it up." "You will." Aunt Mary's voice was sharp, her eyes narrowing. "We'll take you to court if we have to. You're young. You don't know how to fight for what's yours. But we do." The threat of a lawsuit hung in the air like a storm cloud. They had both made it clear that they were willing to drag this out in court, and I could see the determination in their eyes. They weren't going to back down. And I wasn't either. Days turned into weeks, and the legal battles began. My once peaceful life, my quiet routine, was now filled with lawyers, paperwork, and constant bickering. Uncle Joe hired a lawyer who, from the first moment I met him, made it clear that he wasn't interested in any sort of compromise. He wanted to win, and at any cost. Every time I looked around, it seemed like I was surrounded by people who were plotting against me. Aunt Mary would show up at the house, pretending to offer help with organizing Grandpa's things, but it was clear she was keeping an eye on everything I did. Uncle Joe would stop by to check in, but his visits always ended with thinly veiled threats and cold stares. It wasn't just about the property anymore. It was about control, power, and a sense of ownership over what Grandpa had worked his whole life for. And as much as I tried to stay above it all, I could feel myself getting dragged into the whirlwind of bitterness and anger that had taken root in my family. I kept thinking about Grandpa. What would he have wanted? What was his true intention in leaving everything to me? I thought about the long talks we used to have when I was younger. His stories about life, about the importance of family, and about how sometimes the things we inherit aren't just material. They're lessons, memories, and values. Had he seen something in me? Or had he been trying to tell me something that I wasn't ready to understand yet? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't let my family tear me apart. I had to fight for what was mine, not just for the property or the money, but for the legacy Grandpa had left me. I wasn't going to let their bitterness swallow it all. One evening, after another tense meeting with Aunt Mary and Uncle Joe, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The cold air bit at my skin, but it felt good, like a reminder that I still had control over something in my life. I walked down the old dirt road that led to Grandpa's property, past the fields he had loved so much. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, and I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. When I opened my eyes again, I knew what I had to do. I had to stand my ground, not just for myself but for the memory of Grandpa. I couldn't let my family tear each other apart over what he had left behind. It was time to fight for what was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. The air felt different now. Not in any dramatic way, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible shift that marked the beginning of something new. The weight of the last few months was still there, lingering in my bones, in the quiet spaces of my mind, but as I stood in front of the old house, it was the first time in weeks that I didn't feel like I was drowning. I had spent the past few days thinking about everything that had happened, about Grandpa's will, the arguments with my family, the anger that had become a permanent fixture in my life. It was exhausting, and it wasn't the life I wanted anymore. The fighting, the bitterness, the constant feeling of being pulled in every direction. It wasn't me. I had come to a realization. It was time to rebuild, to find my own path again. No more being at the mercy of my family's anger. No more being the object of their jealousy. I was done letting them dictate my life. I was ready to take control, to do something for myself, for the future I wanted to create. But it wasn't going to be easy. The house, the property, all the things that I had inherited, they were overwhelming. I was used to a life that was simple, uncomplicated. But now I had a responsibility. Big one. And though I didn't know the first thing about managing property or running a farm, I knew I had to start somewhere. The first step was admitting I had no idea what I was doing. It was humbling, but I had to face it. I couldn't just pretend I had everything under control. The world around me was in chaos, and I couldn't let that dictate my next move. I needed a plan. So I began with the basics. I hired a financial advisor to help me make sense of everything Grandpa had left behind: debts, taxes, investments. He was a quiet man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, and though he didn't say much, I could tell he understood the pressure I was under. His name was Peter, and from the first meeting, he made it clear that I was in over my head. "Your grandfather left you quite a bit to manage," Peter had said, flipping through the papers in front of him. "But there are complications. You need to make some tough decisions, Emily." I didn't know what he meant by complications, but I could see it in the way he spoke. His words didn't make me feel reassured. If anything, they made everything seem more daunting. As I looked through Grandpa's records, it was clear that there was a lot of work ahead. His debts had accumulated over the years, and the house was in need of repairs. There were also several legal matters to deal with, more than I could count. Everything seemed to be an endless pile of responsibilities that I wasn't sure I was ready for. But that was the first lesson I learned. I wasn't going to be able to do this alone. Not everything could be fixed with sheer willpower. I needed help, and that was okay. Admitting that didn't make me weak. It made me realistic. I had to put aside my pride and accept that I needed others. After the meetings with Peter, I reached out to a few contractors, some of Grandpa's old friends, and people who had worked on the property before. Slowly, I began to form a network of support. They weren't all as experienced as I'd hoped, but they were willing to teach me. And that was the first small victory I had. The willingness to learn, to ask questions, to take the first steps without fear of looking like I didn't know what I was doing. One day, as I walked through the fields behind the house, the wind picking up and swirling the dry leaves at my feet, I realized just how much I had to learn. Grandpa had built this life, this farm, this legacy, and now it was mine to continue. But I wasn't him. I wasn't going to take everything on myself. Couldn't. I spent more time outside, walking the land, getting a feel for it. The scent of the earth, the rustling of the trees. It all reminded me of Grandpa. It reminded me of the simpler times, when everything seemed more grounded. I wanted to find that peace again. Not just the peace of nature, but the peace of being at peace with myself. It was so easy to get swept up in the anger and resentment from my family, but I knew that wasn't the life I wanted. There were moments, though, when I wanted to give up. When the weight of everything, the constant battles, and the reminders of my family's betrayal, felt like too much. But then I'd take a deep breath and remind myself why I was doing this. Grandpa had left this to me for a reason. He'd trusted me to take care of it, to keep it alive, to make something of it. So I kept going. I started reading books on farming, on estate management, and on how to run a business. I learned about everything Grandpa had been involved in, the finances, the farm, the plans he had for the future. Slowly, I began to feel a sense of control returning to my life. But I wasn't just rebuilding the property. I was rebuilding myself. One evening, as I sat at Grandpa's old desk in the study, going over some papers, I heard the door creak open behind me. I turned around to see my cousin, Chloe, standing there. She had always been quiet, always kept to herself, and I wasn't sure what she was doing here. "Hi," she said softly, her voice almost hesitant. "Chloe, what's up?" I asked, surprised to see her. She hesitated, glancing around the room, as if she wasn't sure what to say. I just wanted to apologize," she said, looking down at her feet. "For everything. For what happened after Grandpa died and how I didn't help." I wasn't sure how to respond. I'd spent so much time angry at my family that the idea of someone apologizing was foreign to me. But something in her voice made me pause. "I've been thinking about it," she continued, "and I realize I didn't really see what you were going through. I just thought about myself and what I lost, but you lost him too." Her words hit me harder than I expected. They were simple, but they carried so much weight. I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me still wanted to hold on to my anger, to keep my distance, but another part of me knew that maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward healing. "I'm not sure I know how to move on from everything," I said quietly. "But I'm trying. I'm rebuilding my life, Chloe. And maybe we can rebuild things together. Not just the house, but everything." It was a small step, a fragile truce in a battle that had gone on far too long. But it was a step, and it was enough for now. As I looked out the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, I realized that I was beginning to see the future again. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was no longer a passenger in my own life. I was steering it one decision at a time. And that, for the first time in a long while, felt like enough.